April 1945. As American convoys rolled through the smoking ruins of Western Germany, a small team of U.S. Army logistics officers stumbled upon something extraordinary. Hidden inside cavernous storage depots, once masked beneath camouflage netting and rubble, stood endless rows of crated engines, each one pristine, sealed, untouched by war, stamped with the unmistakable insignia, Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, engines built for the mighty P-47 Thunderbolt. In total, more than 15,000 units, enough to rebuild entire air fleets. German engineers, captured and interrogated nearby, stared in disbelief. To them, it was inconceivable that the Americans could produce so much, and still have thousands to spare. These engines were not just machines. They were proof of an industrial empire that had quietly overwhelmed the Axis. By early 1943, the war in Europe had entered a brutal rhythm of attrition. The Luftwaffe still ruled the skies over occupied territory, its Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs slicing through Allied bomber formations. Every mission over France or the Ruhr Valley meant losses. Dozens of aircraft falling in flames, pilots missing or dead. To win the air war, the Allies needed not only skill, but an unbroken chain of production. Every lost plane had to be replaced faster than the Germans could destroy it. In America, this challenge ignited a machine unlike anything seen before. Factories across the Midwest thundered day and night, turning raw aluminum and steel into the instruments of victory. At the heart of this surge was a new fighter, a machine built not for elegance, but for sheer power. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-47 was enormous for a single-seat fighter, nearly twice the weight of the nimble Spitfire. It was armored, rugged, and carried 8 50-caliber machine guns. But its true soul was its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial beast producing more than 2,000 horsepower. This engine made the P-47 climb faster, dive harder, and survive hits that would tear other fighters apart. It was a flying fortress disguised as a fighter plane. As the 8th Air Force began escorting bombers deep into Germany, the demand for these engines became insatiable. Each sortie consumed hundreds of hours of engine life. Combat damage meant replacements were needed constantly, not only for aircraft destroyed in action, but for those returning home battered, their engines worn or riddled with shrapnel. America's war planners understood that to sustain this pace, production could never pause. In early 1943, General Henry Hap Arnold issued a directive to the War Department and the Army Air Force's Materiel Command. Build beyond need. Prepare for losses greater than expected. Ensure that the front lines will never wait for an engine. That single order transformed America's industrial landscape. Automobile plants in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago were converted to engine assembly lines. Thousands of subcontractors produced bearings, pistons, ignition systems, and exhaust manifolds. The result was an industrial ecosystem of staggering complexity, where a single R2800 could require over 30,000 precision-machined parts sourced from hundreds of towns across the United States. And yet, despite the enormous output, secrecy cloaked the true scale of production. To protect against sabotage, many stockpiles were dispersed and hidden, some in mountain tunnels, others in underground warehouses or far-flung depots across the continental U.S. These caches would remain invisible to most, even to many within the military hierarchy. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt was roaring across Europe, its engines pushing through the thin, icy air at 30,000 feet. But beneath the skies, deep within those quiet American factories, the assembly lines kept moving. Faster, louder, relentless. Engines were built not just for the present war, but for a future no one yet understood. And as the Allied momentum grew, so did the mountain of stored power. Thousands of untouched double wasp engines, waiting for an hour that might never come. By mid-1944, America's war industry had evolved into something closer to an organism than a machine. Self-sustaining, self-feeding, and endlessly adaptable. Across the nation, the rhythm of pistons and presses formed a new kind of heartbeat. In Connecticut, precision machinists at Pratt & Whitney perfected the double wasp's 18-cylinder symmetry. In Illinois and Ohio, railway lines carried engine blocks from one plant to another, each adding layers of components, until the final product emerged gleaming, a symbol of industrial faith. The War Production Board had learned a crucial lesson from the earlier years of the conflict. Stockpiles saved lives. Whenever the front lines demanded replacements, the response could not depend on monthly output alone. It required depth, a hidden reserve ready to surge forward the moment losses spiked. Thus, the system of strategic overproduction was born. Every major plant was ordered to exceed its target by 10 to 15% each quarter. The excess engines were quietly labeled as training use, replacement stock, or overrun. In reality, they were stored in vast depots managed by the Army Air Force's Materiel Command. Some were hidden in the Great Plains, where warehouses stretched for miles near Oklahoma City and Wichita. Others were distributed across the East Coast, near ports that could funnel them overseas within days. This logistical redundancy baffled even some within the Allied High Command. British liaison officers visiting American factories in 1944 wrote astonished reports of production without visible need. But to General Arnold and the Pentagon's logistics chiefs, it was deliberate foresight. They knew that wars are not won at the front. They are won at the factory floor. Every combat victory was merely the visible tip of an invisible industrial iceberg. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was collapsing under its own shortages. By 1944, German aircraft output had peaked, but their supply of engines and fuel had not kept pace. Factories bombed by the 8th Air Force struggled to deliver complete units. Mechanics in the field cannibalized parts from wrecked planes. Where Germany rationed every liter of aviation fuel, America built engines faster than it could deploy them. The scale of difference bordered on the unimaginable. In 1944 alone, the U.S. produced nearly 100,000 aircraft engines, more than Germany managed in the entire war. The R-2800 became the beating heart not only of the P-47, but also the F-6F Hellcat and the B-26 Marauder. Every branch of the military relied on it, and every surplus crate meant insurance against defeat. Yet, with the war turning decisively in the Allies' favor after D-Day, something unexpected occurred. The logistical machine did not slow down. Factories continued to operate at wartime tempo. Contracts, once issued, could not be easily undone. By the winter of 1944, production had outpaced deployment. Engines were piling up faster than aircraft could use them. Shipments intended for Europe were rerouted, stored, or buried within auxiliary depots to prevent confusion in the records. Few outside the logistics command noticed. Fewer still understood the numbers involved. By the spring of 1945, when Germany was already in ruins, tens of thousands of double wasps remained untouched, sealed, catalogued, and forgotten by the tide of victory. What began as a strategy of preparedness had become a monument to abundance, a hidden mountain of power that no battlefield would ever see. And soon, when German engineers finally encountered this silent stockpile, their disbelief would mirror the world's realization of what American industry had truly achieved. 1. Industrial angle. The machine that built the machines. The story of the P-47's hidden engines begins not with pilots, but with welders, riveters, and machinists. By 1943, the United States had achieved what economists later called total war mobilization. Every civilian industry capable of producing metal, fuel, or precision components had been absorbed into the war effort. In Detroit, automobile factories that once assembled Buicks and Fords now produced cylinder heads for fighter engines. In Chicago, washing machine companies built turbo superchargers. Even typewriter manufacturers in New York machined aircraft instrument casings. The result was an economy that could replace destruction with creation faster than any nation in history. When a squadron lost 12 Thunderbolts in one day, replacements arrived before the pilot's next mission briefing. What no one outside the War Department realized was that for every P-47 sent to Europe, another engine waited in storage, its destination unassigned. The sheer momentum of this machine made stoppage impossible. Contracts, quotas, and labor unions bound production lines in continuous motion. Factories operated like arteries. Once opened, they had to keep the blood flowing. So they kept building, even when victory seemed assured. Each completed engine was another testament to the philosophy that more was always better than enough. Engineering angle. The heart of the Thunderbolt. The Wright's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp was more than a motor. It was an achievement of mechanical art. 18 cylinders arranged in two perfect radial rows. A bore and stroke balanced for optimal thermal efficiency. A supercharger that allowed the P-47 to climb to 40,000 feet, where Luftwaffe engines gasped for oxygen. The engine's reliability bordered on legendary. Pilots often returned home with half their cylinders shot out, yet the Thunderbolt still flew. Ground crews could replace a damaged power plant in under 4 hours. A miracle compared to the fragile inline engines of the German Bf-109 or FW-190. Each R2800 weighed more than a small car, but it transformed fuel into thrust with relentless endurance. The engineering philosophy behind it was distinctively American: simplicity through strength. Instead of chasing exotic alloys or fragile tolerances, designers focused on rugged parts, wide tolerances, and standardized components that could be mass-produced by semi-skilled labor. That decision, born of practicality, allowed the U.S. to build tens of thousands without quality collapse. By 1944, entire training manuals emphasized the R2800's modular design. A damaged magneto or cracked exhaust could be replaced with parts from another plant without a single adjustment. This interchangeability, unseen in Axis production, meant that engines could be stored for years and still bolt seamlessly onto new airframes. It was a design made for surplus, built for the logistics of an empire. Strategic angle. The power of overcapacity behind every operational victory was the invisible arithmetic of replacement. A P-47 engine lasted roughly 250 combat hours before requiring overhaul. At the height of the air war, thousands of Thunderbolts operated daily across Europe. Without a vast reserve of engines, entire fighter groups could have been grounded within weeks. American planners understood this in cold, mathematical terms. If combat attrition was inevitable, industrial overproduction was the antidote. The U.S. could afford to lose planes because it could afford to rebuild them. Each hidden depot of double wasps meant another wave of missions, another season of air superiority. This philosophy contrasted starkly with the German mindset. The Reich's engineers built for precision. America built for permanence. When the Luftwaffe calculated fuel and engine hours, the U.S. calculated tonnage and time. It was a contest of philosophy as much as machinery. One fought not in the clouds, but in the foundries below. The discovery of those 15,000 unused engines would later expose the full extent of that philosophy. A nation that had prepared for a war far longer, larger, and more devastating than it ultimately faced. German perspective, The shock of scale for the German engineers and officers captured in 1945, the sight of America's untouched engine reserves, was a revelation that bordered on the unreal. When interrogators from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey showed them warehouses filled with sealed R-2800 engines, many refused to believe the numbers were genuine. To them, it defied logic. Throughout the war, the Luftwaffe had operated on a razor's edge of scarcity. Every engine mattered. Factories in Augsburg and Vienna struggled to replace losses as Allied bombing crippled production. A single raid on the Daimler-Benz or Junkers plants could delay output for months. By 1944, German engine builders were resorting to desperate shortcuts, substituting alloys, skipping tests, assembling units under candlelight in underground tunnels. In that world, the concept of 15,000 unused engines was incomprehensible. To a Luftwaffe officer who had once begged for spare piston rings, it was proof that the Allies had fought a different kind of war altogether, not one of endurance, but of industrial inevitability. Post-war German analysts later referred to it as the material wall, the invisible barrier beyond which no amount of skill or courage could compensate for lack of resources. The Thunderbolt engine stockpiles became the physical embodiment of that wall, cold metal evidence that the Reich's defeat had been written not in battle plans, but in production ledgers. Human angle, the hands behind the power. Beneath the numbers and the machines were the people, the anonymous millions who built, packed, and stored the engines that never flew. In Hartford, women with oil-stained hands balanced precision tools and infants in the same day. In Wisconsin, teenagers fresh out of school learned to weld exhaust manifolds for engines they would never see. They worked in 12-hour shifts under banners that read, "More engines, more freedom." Many of them never knew where their work ended up. Some assumed the engines went straight to the front. Others believed they were destined for future models. None imagined that thousands would be hidden away, stacked in neat rows under tarpaulins, gathering dust as the war raged on. And yet, their labor was not wasted. Each unused engine represented readiness, security, and the promise that no American pilot would fly without the means to fight again. In that sense, the unseen workers became silent guardians of the men in the air. For the pilots, the Thunderbolt was more than a machine. It was trust made tangible. They knew that if they limped back to base with oil leaking and cylinders blown, there would be another engine waiting. That unspoken assurance changed morale itself. Confidence in supply translated into confidence in battle. This human link, from factory to front line, was the quiet backbone of the Allied victory. Even the hidden engines, untouched and unseen, were part of that invisible chain. Moral, philosophical angle. When machines measure nations in the ruins of Germany, as Allied officers documented the discovery, a strange silence surrounded the warehouses. Rows upon rows of crated engines gleamed in the dim light, identical, flawless, untouched. To some, it was a triumph of engineering. To others, it was a haunting question. What does it mean when a nation can build more engines than war can destroy? When preparation surpasses need, and victory leaves behind mountains of unused power, the hidden P-47 engines became more than historical curiosity. They were a mirror. They reflected the transformation of warfare itself, from courage and strategy to the domination of industry, logistics, and production mathematics. Wars had always been decided by bravery. Now they were decided by throughput. Historians would later call it the American century, but it began here in the warehouses of surplus, where every crate was both a testament to foresight and a warning about excess. For the first time in human history, victory was not defined by what a nation could sacrifice, but by what it could endlessly build. And for the German engineers who witnessed it, the shock never faded. They had seen the future of warfare, and it was measured not in lives, but in horsepower. It was the spring of 1945. The Reich was collapsing. Allied armies swept eastward across the Rhine, uncovering the remnants of Hitler's once vast war machine. In shattered factories and silent airfields, engineers from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey began cataloging what was left behind. Destroyed engines, burnt-out machine tools, fractured production lines. But what they found next defied expectation. Near Essen, in the industrial heart of the Ruhr, a recon team followed up on intelligence suggesting a concealed Allied supply depot, one that had been overrun, abandoned, and later retaken. The entrance was buried under twisted steel and concrete. When they pried it open, the flashlights caught an eerie sight. Rows upon rows of wooden crates stretching into the darkness. Inside the first crate lay a pristine Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, its serial number gleaming, its parts wrapped in wax paper. It had never been used. Word spread quickly through the command structure. What began as a routine inventory turned into a logistical revelation. Engine after engine was uncovered, each tagged, sealed, untouched. When the final count came in, the figure stunned even the most seasoned officers. More than 15,000 operational engines, hidden across multiple depots in France, Belgium, and Germany. To the Germans who were interrogated after the discovery, it was a psychological blow. One former Luftwaffe logistics officer, upon seeing the photographs, murmured, "Das ist unmöglich. Niemand hat so viel Macht." That's impossible. No one has that kind of power. For years, the Luftwaffe had calculated Allied strength using visible production numbers. Aircraft lost, aircraft built. They had never imagined that tens of thousands of engines could exist beyond the battlefield, lying dormant, waiting. For the Americans, the revelation had a different tone, a mix of pride and disbelief. Reports from the U.S. Army Air Force's Materiel Command confirmed that these stockpiles were not accidental. They were the product of intentional overproduction, strategic dispersion, and wartime redundancy. Some depots had been originally established to protect against bombing disruptions. Others were built as overflow centers when European demand slowed after D-Day. Each one had quietly accumulated power beyond measure. As engineers inspected the crates, they noted the consistency. Every component meticulously preserved, each magneto lubricated, each piston coated with protective film. Even after years in storage, most engines could be installed and started within hours. The preservation was so complete that post-war test runs achieved full rated power without adjustment. When the German technical officers saw these demonstrations, they were silent. They had spent months fighting to rebuild shattered factories under Allied bombardment. And here, their captors revealed that they had enough engines to replace the entire Luftwaffe several times over. To them, it was not merely defeat, it was revelation. They realized that the war had been lost long before the first Allied soldier crossed the Rhine. It had been lost in the unseen arithmetic of production, in the cold logic of an economy that could build beyond destruction. For the Americans, these warehouses were something different, a mirror reflecting what industrial democracy could achieve when mobilized without limit. As one colonel wrote in his report, "The enemy fought with courage, but courage could not compete with this." The crates stood like monuments to that truth, a silent forest of steel and wood, where every engine whispered the same story. That power, once multiplied by will and industry, could become unstoppable. In the months that followed Germany's surrender, the story of the hidden P-47 engines spread quietly through Allied technical circles. Reports compiled by the U.S. Army Air Force's Materiel Command and the Strategic Bombing Survey detailed the staggering overproduction in exact figures. Factories had produced engines at such a rate that even after meeting all wartime demands, replacements, training, and attrition, tens of thousands remained untouched. The revelation forced a reevaluation of what the term industrial warfare truly meant. To historians, this was the turning point. Not a battle, but an awakening. For the first time, war had been won by surplus capacity, not by tactical genius or superior weapons, but by the ability to build faster than the enemy could destroy. The hidden engines symbolized the point where American industry had transcended necessity. It was no longer producing for survival. It was producing for dominance. German analysts, interviewed during the post-war interrogations at Freiburg and Wiesbaden, repeatedly expressed disbelief. They had known the U.S. had a large industrial base, but not this. The Luftwaffe's intelligence estimates had assumed that Allied aircraft replacement capacity could sustain losses of perhaps 15 to 20% per month. The reality, they discovered, was closer to 60%, and still the Americans would not have run short. One German engineer compared it to fighting the sea. No matter how many ships you sink, the tide keeps coming. That metaphor became hauntingly accurate. While German pilots flew increasingly desperate missions with engines patched together from spare parts, the U.S. had more power plants in storage than Germany had operational aircraft. The implications rippled far beyond aviation. Military planners recognized that this model, overcapacity as strategy, was not wasteful. It was decisive. The same philosophy had powered America's tank and ship production. But the P-47 engines, discovered intact in forgotten depots, became the most visible proof of what total industrial readiness could achieve. In internal memos from the U.S. War Department, one logistics officer wrote, "We learned that quantity, when disciplined, becomes a form of quality. It is not chaos. It is control at scale." This insight would shape American defense thinking for decades. When the Cold War began, the lesson of the hidden engines resurfaced, influencing everything from nuclear deterrence strategy to aircraft manufacturing philosophy. The principle was simple: never build enough. Always build more. For Germany, however, the discovery was humiliating in its clarity. Captured engineers studying American production reports realized how small their own industrial system truly was. They had believed in the superiority of design and craftsmanship. They had built elegant, efficient machines, but in numbers too few to matter. In the face of America's assembly line abundance, precision had lost its meaning. Years later, when post-war German aviation pioneers like Kurt Tank and Willy Messerschmitt reviewed Allied archives, they encountered the data on surplus P-47 engines. Their comments were brief, almost resigned. Tank reportedly told a British officer, "We never stood a chance. You didn't outfly us. You outbuilt us." By then, the depots had already begun to empty. Some engines were sold for civilian use. Others shipped to storage yards awaiting new aircraft designs. Many would later find new life in Korea, bolted to training planes or cargo craft. Yet, thousands were simply melted down, victims of peacetime's return. But in 1945, when the floodlights first illuminated those endless rows, everyone present understood the same thing. This was not just a stockpile. It was the physical embodiment of a truth that had defined the modern age, that victory no longer belonged to the boldest commander, but to the nation that could build forever. The revelation of 15,000 hidden P-47 engines did not merely shock German engineers. It reshaped Allied understanding of industrial warfare. Reports filed by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey emphasized that these engines had been the backbone of sustained air operations across Europe. Without them, replacement schedules would have faltered, and air superiority over France and Germany might have been compromised. The Thunderbolt squadrons that escorted bombers into the Ruhr Valley and across the Rhine relied on a confidence few realized was grounded in steel and aluminum. Pilots knew that even if their engines failed, a replacement awaited, somewhere in a warehouse no one ever flew over. This invisible supply chain ensured continuous pressure on the Luftwaffe. accelerating Germany's collapse in the final months of the war. Beyond the immediate tactical advantage, the discovery highlighted a broader strategic lesson. Victory in modern warfare was no longer defined solely by battlefield heroics. It was defined by the capacity to sustain operations relentlessly. The hidden engines were proof that American planners had anticipated not only combat attrition, but also the unforeseen, sabotaged shipments, delayed deployments, and the sheer chaos of war. They had built not just machines, but resilience itself. For the Luftwaffe, the effect was psychological even before the war ended. Captured officers described the realization that the enemy's resources were essentially limitless as devastating. They had been trained to respect skill, innovation, and bravery. They had underestimated the quiet, mechanical tide that would sweep over them, one measured in horsepower and crate numbers rather than aerial duels. In the United States, the stockpiles were quietly catalogued and redistributed. Some engines were sent to newly forming units in the Pacific Theater. Others were used in training aircraft to prepare pilots for post-war service. The surplus extended the operational life of the P-47 well beyond what had been anticipated, allowing it to serve as a backbone in the early stages of the Korean War. Historians later noted that the warehouses were as much a weapon as any fighter or bomber. They represented the material expression of a philosophy. War is fought not just on the front, but in the factory, in the design office, and in the supply chain. The sight of rows upon rows of engines, stacked and untouched, became emblematic of America's unique advantage, a combination of industrial scale, engineering foresight, and logistical discipline that the Axis powers could never match. By the time the last crates were inventoried, the war in Europe was over. Yet those engines, silent, pristine, and untapped, would echo the lessons of 1945 for decades. They reminded the world that in modern warfare, the unseen often determines the outcome more than the seen. In the months following the German surrender, the hidden P-47 engines became more than a historical footnote. They became a blueprint for modern military logistics. The U.S. Air Force, newly independent in 1947, studied the depots and inventories meticulously. They sought to understand how industrial overproduction could provide strategic advantage without creating waste. The hidden engines demonstrated that surplus could act as deterrence. A nation that could outbuild any adversary would never face crippling shortages. Some engines were shipped to European allies under the Marshall Plan, strengthening post-war air forces and reinforcing the U.S. position as a global power. Others were incorporated into new aircraft for training, allowing the next generation of pilots to gain experience without risking operational losses. The P-47 itself, powered by these engines, remained a symbol of reliability and endurance, serving well into the early 1950s in secondary theaters and training squadrons. For historians and military theorists, the discovery revealed a fundamental truth. Wars are increasingly won by infrastructure and preparation, not just tactics and bravery. The Axis powers had excelled at engineering ingenuity, but their limited production capacity constrained their strategy. The Allies, particularly the United States, leveraged mass production, logistics, and foresight to turn industrial might into a decisive weapon. The hidden engine stockpiles crystallized this reality in the most tangible way possible. Steel and aluminum arranged in silent rows, awaiting an opportunity to act. The psychological effect on post-war German engineers and planners was profound. Many of them later contributed to NATO aviation projects or civilian aerospace programs, carrying with them the enduring awareness that industrial scale could outmatch individual skill. The memory of the 15,000 untouched R-2800 engines became a cautionary tale. Innovation alone cannot sustain war. It must be paired with mass production, redundancy, and disciplined logistics. Even decades later, the warehouses themselves long since emptied or repurposed, remained a symbol. They represented the unseen foundation of victory, the quiet, patient work of thousands of hands, producing far more than the world could immediately see or deploy. Every crate, every engine, was a testament to foresight, planning, and the relentless logic of industrial warfare. By the end of 1945, the war in Europe had ended, but the hidden engines had already reshaped how nations conceived power. They were a reminder that in the modern era, victory was not only fought with courage and bullets, it was built in factories, counted in parts, and measured in horsepower. And that understanding would carry forward into the Cold War, forever changing the calculus of military readiness. The warehouses lay silent, their floors lined with engines that had never roared in combat. 15,000 R-2800s, invisible pillars of victory, spoke of a truth often overlooked. Wars are not only won in the skies, but in the quiet hum of factories, the careful hands of engineers, and the tireless rhythm of assembly lines. These engines embodied more than power. They embodied foresight. They were a testament to a nation's ability to plan, to endure, and to build beyond immediate need. For the pilots who flew the Thunderbolt, each engine was an unspoken promise that no matter the danger, a replacement waited, ready, precise, and unwavering. For the German engineers who witnessed them, they were a lesson in scale and inevitability. Skill and courage could not match the sheer force of industrial preparation. And for history itself, these hidden engines became a mirror, a reminder that modern warfare is a collision not only of strategy and valor, but of logistics, production, and relentless human ingenuity. In the end, the P-47 engines were more than machines. They were symbols of resilience, of silent labor, of the unseen forces that decide the fate of nations. Their story reminds us that behind every victory, there is an empire of hands and minds working unseen, waiting for the moment to tip the balance. The war in Europe ended, but the lesson of the hidden engines endured. Power is not measured only in battles won, but in the preparedness to endure and the wisdom to build beyond need.